My name is Eric Dalton. I'm 44 years old, a retired master sergeant with the 101st Airborne Division. For most of my adult life, I served my country with quiet commitment for tours overseas, long nights in the field, and the kind of responsibility that doesn't make headlines but keeps things running. I never asked for much. A steady home, a woman I could trust, a place to return to when the world got too loud. Last year, while stationed at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, I received an email that changed everything. 14 years of marriage ended in a subject line that read, "Let's keep this civil." My wife, Karen, had filed for divorce. She had emptied our joint savings, and she had moved her new boyfriend into our home in Boise, Idaho, without so much as a phone call. I remember staring at the screen for a long time. Not angry, not heartbroken, just still. There are moments in life where everything shifts and, deep down, that nothing will be the same again. This was one of those moments, and I knew I had to choose how to respond. I didn't reply right away. I closed my laptop, stood up from the small plywood desk I shared with two other guys in the barracks, and stepped outside into the warm desert night. The wind moved low across the sand, and the only sounds were the distant hum of generators and the rhythmic scuff of boots from the night shift rotation. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, looking out into the dark. 14 years. We'd built a life together, or at least I thought we had. A house in a quiet neighborhood. Shared dreams. Shared sacrifices. I've been gone a lot, sure, but always for duty, never for selfishness. And now it was over. Not in a fight, not in a moment of weakness, but in 4 cold sentences tucked inside an email sent halfway across the world. I didn't scream, didn't punch a wall. That's not who I am. The Army teaches you to stay calm under pressure, to process the facts, and act only when the mission is clear. So I finished my shift, drank my usual 2 cups of black coffee in the chow hall. And when I finally sat back down at my desk that night, I opened the email again, typed a single word, noted, and hit send. Wilson, one of the younger guys in my unit, noticed something was off. "Everything all right, Sarge?" he asked without looking up from his book. "Yeah," I said. "Just stuff back home." He nodded once and left it there. That's the thing about guys who've seen things. They know when to speak, and when silence is the only kind of respect that matters. Later that night, I lay in my bunk staring at the ceiling fan spinning slow overhead. There was no sadness, not yet, just a sense of finality. A door had closed. One I didn't choose, but one I could no longer ignore. And even in that moment, I knew I wouldn't be chasing anyone. Not Karen. Not answers. What I'd do instead was prepare. I remembered something my father once told me when I was a teenager, frustrated over a breakup. He said, "Son, people will leave you. Sometimes they'll hurt you. You don't get to decide how they act, but you get to decide what kind of man you are when they do." I carried that with me for decades, and tonight, it felt more like instruction than comfort. So I did what soldiers do when the mission changes. I adjusted my stance, and I waited for daylight. 6 months before deployment, something shifted. Karen stopped laughing at my jokes. She started staying late at the clinic, saying she had to finish paperwork or cover for another employee. She joined a CrossFit gym, but never talked about it. When I asked how her workouts were going, she'd say fine, without looking up from her phone. That same phone had a new passcode, one I wasn't told and honestly didn't ask for. See, I'm not the type to check a spouse's phone. Never have been. I believe trust is something you give until it's taken away. But I've also spent 2 decades in the Army, and I've learned how to spot changes in routine, how to notice when something small means something bigger. Her schedule started filling up with girls' nights and team retreats. There were new clothes in her closet, bags I didn't recognize. When I asked about them, she'd shrug it off. They were on sale. That's when I knew something was coming. I didn't know what or when, but I felt in my gut. And when your gut talks, especially after years in combat zones, you learn to listen. I didn't accuse her. I didn't ask for explanations she wasn't offering. Instead, I went quiet and started making my own adjustments. The way I saw it, if I was wrong, no harm done. But if I was right, I needed to be ready. I started with the basics, our paperwork. I pulled the house deed, our insurance documents, my discharge papers, and tucked them into a safe deposit box at a bank branch in Twin Falls, under just my name. I reviewed our accounts and set up a new trust, simple, legal, and separate. I began diverting a portion of my paycheck there. Not a lot, just enough that if everything went sideways, I wouldn't be standing flat-footed. Next were the things money couldn't replace. My dad's Navy medals. My grandfather's watch, a wind-up Elgin that he wore to his first job interview after coming home from Korea. I packed them carefully and mailed them to my brother Luke, who kept a cabin up in the mountains of Montana. Just keep these safe, I told him. You'll know why soon enough. Luke didn't ask questions. He's family. He understood. I also took photos of everything. Every document, every bank statement, every login screen. I encrypted the files and stored them on a cloud drive I created using a service based out of Texas. I didn't want to be blindsided, not while I was 7,000 miles away serving a country that had never turned its back on me. I wasn't about to leave my future in the hands of someone who might. That fall, right before deployment, Karen and I went to dinner at a steakhouse we used to love. I wanted to feel like us again. Maybe remind her who we were when it all started. I wore a pressed shirt, even shaved, which isn't something I do often when I'm off duty. She smiled across the table, polite but distant, like we were two strangers sharing appetizers. Over dessert, I mentioned the idea of re-enlisting for one more tour, just 4 more years. She looked at me, not with fear or sadness, but frustration. I can't do this anymore, Eric. I didn't sign up for a marriage where I'm alone half the time. I nodded. You knew I was in the Army when we met. She sighed. I thought it would get easier. The truth was, it never does. But I didn't say that. I just looked down at the half-melted scoop of ice cream in front of me and knew that night marked something final. I paid the bill, held the door open for her on the way out, and never brought up re-enlistment again. A week later, I deployed. She drove me to the airport, hugged me goodbye, and said, "Take care of yourself. No te hagas. No lingering glance." Just the same way you might see someone off before a long business trip. The moment the wheels left the tarmac, I stopped hoping. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. My job from that moment forward wasn't to hold on to something already gone. It was to protect what remained. Some people pack for war with body armor and weapons. I left with a locked-down financial trail, a sealed box of memories, and a mind that had already started letting go. I didn't know how or when it would all unravel, but I knew when it did, I'd be standing on solid ground. And that was enough. I met Karen back in the spring of 2007 at a veterans fundraiser in Spokane. It was one of those small-town events where half the people were shaking hands and the other half were scooping potato salad. I'd just gotten back from my second deployment to Afghanistan, still getting used to the quiet hum of everyday life. Karen was volunteering at the event, organizing raffle tickets, and wearing a navy blue polo with student physical therapist embroidered above the pocket. She had this calm about her, steady hands, kind eyes, the sort of person who made you feel like everything was going to be okay. We struck up a conversation over coffee. She asked about my unit, and I asked about her school. She admitted she wasn't sure if physical therapy was what she really wanted, but she liked helping people, and that felt like enough for now. 3 weeks later, we were having dinner at a quiet diner on the edge of town. She wore a green sweater that matched her eyes, and I remember thinking how strange it felt to feel relaxed for once. After years of alertness, desert patrols, night watches, missing birthdays, I finally found someone who made me feel human again. We were married 9 months after that. Looking back, I think part of what brought us together was that I needed peace, and she offered it. She used to call me her hero, said she admired my discipline, the way I made the bed each morning with sharp corners. She liked that I had a mission, a purpose, and I liked how she smiled when she talked about the future kids, a garden, a yellow kitchen. We built a life around those small dreams. We bought our house in Boise in 2010. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, built in the 70s, but solid. Nothing flashy, just a good home. My name was on the mortgage because I used a VA loan, but I added Karen to the deed a year later. That's what marriage is, I thought, sharing the weight. The early years were good. She finished her degree, found work at a small chiropractic clinic, and built strong friendships. I was deployed twice more, but came home safe each time. We found our rhythm weekend hikes, Sunday morning pancakes, the occasional getaway to the Oregon coast. We had our share of arguments, but never anything I'd call a serious crack. Until later. Around 2016, things began to shift. Nothing dramatic at first, just subtle changes, like the way she'd grow quiet when I talked about re-enlisting. She started rolling her eyes when I mentioned base politics or soldiers I was mentoring. One time, during dinner with friends, she joked that Eric's married to the Army more than he is to me. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, but it stuck with me. I tried to fix it. I scaled back on volunteer duties, made more time at home, planned trips I knew she'd enjoy. But the distance between us wasn't about time, it was about values. The longer we were together, the more I realized Karen had been hoping I would eventually leave the Army, settle into something more normal. But normal to her wasn't normal to me. Then came 2018. I brought up the idea of one more tour. Just 4 years. The benefits, the pension, the structure. She shut it down immediately. I can't do this again, she said. I can't spend another Christmas alone, pretending everything's fine. That argument lasted days. Not loud, not cruel, just long and unresolved. She didn't threaten to leave. She didn't cry. She just stopped engaging. There was a silence in the house after that, a kind of invisible wall between us. But I stayed. I wanted to believe things would get better. That once we were through the rough patch, we'd find our way back to the version of ourselves we used to beta Eric and Karen, who slow danced in the kitchen, who read books in bed with the windows open in July. But what I didn't understand then was that love isn't enough if respect disappears. By the time I deployed to Qatar, I think she'd already made up her mind. Maybe not about Brad specifically, but about us. And I suppose I had to, deep down. I'd already put my contingency plans in motion. I wasn't holding on to illusions anymore. I just didn't want to be the one to pull the trigger. In her defense, Karen never signed up for life with a soldier. She signed up for me. But me and the Army, we were one and the same. You don't serve that long without it becoming part of your bones. I think she thought she could change that, soften it somehow. But that's not how it works. The Army made me who I am: steadfast, patient, prepared. That same mindset, in the end, is what helped me survive what she did next. Well, I got that email in Qatar cold. For sentences long it hurt, yes. But it didn't surprise me. Karen had left long before she sent it. Her body stayed, but her mind, her loyalty, her care, those had been packed away months ago. I stared at that message for a long time, not because I needed to absorb it, but because I was saying goodbye. Not just to her, but to who we used to be, to the dreams we painted together in soft colors. And when I finally closed the laptop, stood up, and walked out into the desert air, I didn't feel empty. I felt free. When someone hits you that hard, emotionally, your first instinct is either to fight back or walk away. But I've never been the kind to act on emotion. In the Army, you learn that your anger doesn't help you, your discipline does. So instead of replying to Karen's email with rage or heartbreak, I made a decision. I would handle this the same way I handled every mission: assess, prepare, execute. The first step was securing what was mine. I logged into our joint accounts that night from base, and what I saw didn't surprise me. She hadn't just taken a portion, she'd emptied them. Every penny, even the small travel fund we'd been building for years. Zero balance. She must have waited until my mid-month direct deposit landed, then moved it all. I flagged the accounts for suspicious activity and placed immediate holds where I could. Most banks won't act without a formal complaint, but military credentials carry weight. I wasn't trying to undo the theft, just Yeti was building a paper trail. Then I contacted Ryan McAllister, a lawyer I'd helped years back when he was a new dad struggling with VA paperwork. He owed me a favor, and I called it in. We set up a secure line call. I laid out the situation, and to his credit, Ryan didn't flinch. First thing, he said, "You need to come home early. Emergency leave." "I'm not injured," I replied. "Doesn't matter. You're dealing with legal fraud and financial misconduct. You served 20 years. They'll grant it." He was right. Within 48 hours, I had clearance to fly home under emergency leave. I didn't tell Karen. I didn't want a scene, and frankly, I didn't want to step back into a house where Brad was likely walking my dog and drinking coffee from my favorite mug. I landed in Portland and went straight to a buddy's place in Eugene. He left me the keys, didn't ask questions, another soldier who understood that silence sometimes says more than comfort. From there, I spent 2 weeks building my case. I combed through every joint statement, every withdrawal, every email she'd sent from our shared digital life. Karen had been draining small amounts for months, $400 here, $1,100 there, enough to avoid raising alarms. But over 6 months, those numbers added up. Nearly $67,000 in total, most of it funneled directly into Brad's business account. The name on the wire transfers? Hers. But what caught my attention more was the mortgage file. The house had a second lien I never authorized. I checked the signature me name, but it wasn't my handwriting. The slant was wrong. The D in Dalton had a loop I've never used in my life. It was forgery. Ryan's reaction was immediate. This just went from divorce to felony. I hired a private investigator in Boise. He went by Mark, a wiry guy with a retired cop vibe who had a network of contacts and an eye for patterns. Within 5 days, he confirmed everything we feared. Brad's outdoor lifestyle brand was a shell. The company was mostly social media hype, selling trucker hats and whiskey tumblers. Karen had pumped tens of thousands into it since the fall. Mark also tracked a car lease in her name but driven by Brad, and a new credit card she'd opened with my social security number attached. Identity theft, mortgage fraud, embezzlement, and betrayal, dressed up in yoga pants and wellness retreats. Ryan compiled everything into a comprehensive file: statements, screenshots, video from my home's Ring camera, even digital timestamp from the notary appointment for the forged mortgage. We delivered it to the FBI and the local district attorney's office. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. Karen hadn't just broken my trust, she'd committed crimes. She thought my absence was a free pass. What she didn't realize was that distance doesn't erase documentation. It just delays it. 3 weeks after I arrived back in the States, I finally returned to Boise. I didn't go home. Instead, I waited until we had confirmation that a fraud case had been opened. Then I showed up at the house with Ryan at my side. Brad answered the door, wearing one of my flannel shirts. I looked him in the eye and asked for Karen. She came out with her arms folded, defensive from the start. But I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply handed her an envelope. Inside, a civil suit, a fraud complaint, and notification of pending criminal investigation. This isn't personal, I told her. It's legal. She said she was confused, that we should talk, that she didn't know how things got so far. I didn't engage, because at that point, this wasn't about feelings. It was about facts. I had done the work. She had made the decisions. The rest was just a matter of time. I didn't step back into my old house the day I served Karen the papers. I stood on the porch, watched Brad fade into the background like smoke. I had no interest in drama or redemption speeches. I wasn't there to reclaim anything. I was there to set things straight. Karen stood in the doorway with the envelope in her hands, trying to process what had just happened. "You're not staying?" she asked, voice quieter than I'd expected. "No," I said. "I'm staying in Oregon. I'll let the lawyers handle the rest." She looked like she wanted to say something else, maybe explain, maybe justify. But I'd already made up my mind. I turned, walked down the steps, and got into my rental. She didn't follow. Back at my buddy's cabin in Eugene, I finally slept. Not the restless, guarded kind I'd gotten used to overseas. This was deep, clean, like my body finally understood the fight was behind me. Over the next few weeks, Karen's legal team tried to reach me with settlement offers. At first, they were laughable, splitting everything 50-50, ignoring the fraud. Then they offered her share of the house in exchange for a portion of my pension. I didn't respond to a single message. Ryan did that for me. And every time they tested the line, we pulled the rope tighter. When someone commits forgery and grand theft in a marriage, you don't negotiate your way back to neutral. You move forward with the facts. 3 weeks after the initial confrontation, I received a call from Mark, the private investigator. "You might want to know," he said, "Brad's business filed for bankruptcy." No surprise. Karen had been his bankroll, and now she couldn't touch the money. The mortgage funds were frozen, and the DA had attached a lien to the house. They were both burning through fumes. Another week later, Ryan called with the kind of tone you remember. "She's ready to settle," he said. "Full surrender." The deal was straightforward. Karen forfeited her share of the house, returned the second mortgage funds through restitution, waived all rights to my pension, and signed a statement admitting to the forgery. In return, we wouldn't press criminal charges. I sat with that decision for a long while. Not because I doubted what I should do, but because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means letting go of the power someone holds over your peace. "Send her the agreement," I told Ryan. "Let her sign it." 2 days later, it was done. The notary documents arrived in my inbox at 8:17 a.m. I sat with my coffee, watching the morning light crawl across the floorboards of the cabin, and clicked through them page by page. Her signature was real this time. The ink thin, deliberate but steady. I forwarded everything to my financial advisor and began the process of selling the house. Not out of spite, but because that house wasn't mine anymore. Not really. The foundation had been cracked long before the paperwork caught up. It was time to build something new. I closed on the house in September. The proceeds went toward a piece of land in Montana, 5 acres near Livingston, backed up to a creek and surrounded by trees tall enough to block out the noise of the world. There was a weathered red barn on the property and an old work shed that just needed new nails and a little time. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I drove out there with Scout, the German shepherd I'd adopted from a shelter 2 towns over. He took to the place faster than I did. On that first night, we sat on the porch together, watching the sunset melt into the mountains. It felt like breathing for the first time in a long time. Some nights, I'd find myself going over the past wondering how long the signs had been there. Wondering if Karen had planned everything from the beginning, or if she'd just fallen into the arms of someone who told her what she wanted to hear. But the truth is, it didn't matter anymore. The past had happened. It was written in signed court documents, frozen bank accounts, and quiet goodbyes. The future was what mattered now. I built a modest woodworking shop out of the old shed. Started making furniture for locals' benches, shelves, a few custom pieces for the nearby general store. The work was simple, honest, and steady. Kind of like I used to be before I got buried in the weight of someone else's disappointment. People around town knew me just as Eric, the quiet guy with a good dog and steady hands. They didn't ask about Brad or Karen, and I didn't offer. I went fishing in the mornings, took Scout hiking in the afternoons, cut firewood when the air started to cool, slept with the windows open and the doors locked only out of habit, not fear. The Army taught me how to survive. But this new life was teaching me how to live. And when people asked if I ever regretted walking away instead of fighting harder, I'd just say, I didn't walk away. I moved on. Because there's a difference. The legal battle ended quietly, like a storm that finally ran out of sky. Karen signed the full settlement. No alimony, no stake in my pension, no claim to the Montana property I just purchased. She returned what remained of the forged mortgage, payout roughly $38,000 after the damage had already been done, and walked away with little more than her name and what was left of her dignity. I didn't attend the final court session. Ryan handled that. She looked tired, he told me over the phone, like someone who'd lost the thread of her own story. I didn't feel triumphant hearing that. Just finished. Brad's situation unraveled even faster. Without Karen's money, his so-called outdoor brand collapsed. Turns out, Instagram posts don't pay lease agreements, and when the vendor invoices came due, he had nothing to fall back on. I heard through Mark the investigator that Brad had tried to start a GoFundMe, claimed he was the victim of a toxic smear campaign, and that his business had been sabotaged by government overreach. It raised exactly $127 before it disappeared. He left Boise not long after that. Karen stayed. She returned to her chiropractic clinic, though business had slowed. Rumors in a small town move like smoke, quiet, but hard to escape. Patients canceled. Friends distanced themselves. People didn't say much to her face, but she could feel it. The same way I used to feel the silence in our kitchen when I came home from deployment. She reached out once, 3 weeks after the papers were finalized. A text message, short and hesitant. I hope you're doing okay. I stared at it for a while. Didn't respond. Some bridges don't burn in a blaze. Some just sink plank by plank until there's nothing left but water and the memory of how you used to cross it. I wasn't angry anymore. I just had no more energy to give her. Not even for closure. My new life in Montana settled into a rhythm. Morning started early coffee before sunrise, a short walk with Scout, then hours in the woodshop. I took custom orders through word of mouth, never advertised. Folks in town respected that. They liked things built by hand, by someone who knew how to take his time. One customer, an older widow named Marlene, asked me to build a dining table to replace the one she and her late husband had shared for 40 years. I want something strong, she said. Something that won't fall apart when the years lean heavy on it. I built it from reclaimed oak and finished it with beeswax and care. She cried when she saw it. That's more than a table, she told me. That's a promise. Those are the kinds of days that fill me now. Not headlines, not courtroom drama, just small, sturdy moments that held real meaning. I started volunteering at a veterans group once a week. Nothing formal, just helping younger guys transition out of service, teaching basic budgeting, resume writing, a little woodworking if they were interested. One of them, a 26-year-old Navy vet named Isaiah, asked me how I'd handle my own transition. Takes time, I told him, but it gets easier, especially once you start building a life that no one else can wreck. He nodded slowly like he understood, even if it hadn't settled in yet. I never spoke much about Karen. Not because I was hiding anything, but because she no longer took up that space in my story. She had her chapter, and it was over. I wasn't trying to rewrite it or burn a tide, just closed the book and moved on to the next one. One afternoon, around late fall, I drove into Livingston to drop off a bench I'd made for the local library. As I was loading it into the back of the truck, a man approached me. "You're Eric Dalton, right?" I nodded, guarded but polite. "My cousin lives in Boise," he said. "Said your story got passed around a bit." I waited. "She told me you handled everything with class. Said you didn't make a scene, didn't go to the papers. Just did what needed doing." I shrugged. "Only way I know." He smiled. "Well, a lot of folks wouldn't have handled it that way. Thought you should hear that from someone." It hit me then, more than in any courtroom or signed document. I hadn't just reclaimed my life, I'd reclaimed my name. Not through revenge, not by dragging anyone down, but by holding the line, by staying steady, by letting the facts speak louder than my feelings. There's a quiet kind of strength in that, when you don't need to shout about. I still get the occasional email from Karen's old friends. Apologies, explanations, stories about how she's trying to rebuild. I wish her peace, but from a distance. My life now is small on purpose. I've traded chaos for clarity, and that's a deal I'd make again in a heartbeat. When someone lights a match in your life, don't waste your time chasing the flame. Let them burn out on their own. Then build something that doesn't burn. I never thought I'd find peace in sanding pine. But that's where it started, hands on wood. Mind focused on each pass of the grain. The noise of the world softened under the hum of my sander and the rustle of wind through the pines behind my shop. Some folks heal through therapy, others through travel. Me? I built furniture. It began small. A bookshelf, then a rocking chair. A neighbor dropped by one morning asking if I could craft a porch swing for her granddaughter. 2 weeks later, I delivered a cedar swing with brass chains and her family crest carved into the seat back. "Feels like it's always been here," she said, resting her hand on the wood like it meant something more than a place to sit. And maybe it did, because when your life cracks apart, you don't glue the pieces back the same way. You start fresh. You build slow. You don't rush a foundation that's meant to hold real weight. Montana gave me room for that. The land out here has a way of forcing patience on you. It doesn't care about deadlines or headlines. The snow comes when it's ready. The rivers thaw in their own time. It reminded me to stop forcing things to happen on my schedule. Scout helped too. He's a 5-year-old German Shepherd mix I picked up from the local shelter. Smart, loyal, a little rough around the edges like me, I guess. He doesn't need much. Just a full bowl, a warm bed, and someone to come home to. Every morning we walk 2 miles down the ridge behind my place. The air's crisp, the trail's quiet. It clears my head in ways nothing else ever did. No phone buzzing, no voices tugging, just boots in the dirt and the knowledge that I've made it this far. There's a certain dignity in quiet survival, in rebuilding your life not with noise, but with steady hands and a clear conscience. And people notice that kind of strength even when you're not trying to show it. One Saturday morning, a man stopped by the shop, looked to be in his late 50s, drove a dusty Ford with a Vietnam veteran's plate. He stood at the doorway for a while before speaking. "You Dalton?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I'm Bill. My niece told me you helped her out with that dining table last winter. Said you're the kind of man who listens more than he talks." I nodded. "That's probably true." He took off his cap. "I've got a grandson. Lost his dad in Iraq. Been angry since he could talk. He's got good hands, though. Doesn't do well in classrooms, but he's sharp. Thought maybe you'd let him help around the shop this summer." We shook on it the next day. That kid, his name's Jacob, started showing up with his sleeves rolled and questions ready. I taught him how to use a plane, how to read wood, how to work with what's there instead of trying to force something it's not meant to be. "You don't fight the grain," I told him one afternoon. "You work with it." He looked up at me and said, "That sounds like life." Smart kid. Teaching him reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that we don't just rebuild for ourselves. We rebuild so others have a path to walk. Something stable underfoot. And it wasn't just him. Over time, word got around. Other vets stopped by. Some for advice. Some for work. One just needed someone to sit with while he talked about the wife who left him while he was overseas. I didn't say much. Just poured us coffee and nodded where it counted. That's how healing works, sometimes not with big gestures, but with quiet presence. With showing up, staying put, and not flinching when someone else's pain brushes against your own. In the evenings, I'd sit out on the back deck, watching the sun set over the ridge. Sometimes I'd sip bourbon. Other times I'd just listen to the frogs down by the creek. It's the kind of silence that hums, not the kind that haunts. Once in a while, I'd get a letter. From a client. From someone who heard the story secondhand. From a military spouse wanting advice. They always said the same thing in different words. "I don't know how you made it through, but thank you for reminding me that it's possible." I kept those letters in a drawer next to the workbench. Not for pride, for perspective. Because if there's one thing I've learned in this whole journey, it's this: survival isn't enough. Not after a betrayal that deep. You can't just scrape by and call that living. You rebuild. Not for revenge, but for restoration. You clear the burned ground. Plant something honest in its place. You build walls that don't shut people out but remind them this time it's going to be different. Stronger. Wiser. Not perfect, but real. And when the past tries to sneak back, honest, it sometimes does. You don't open the door. You don't reread old messages or wonder how it might have gone differently. You just keep working the wood. Keep walking the dog. Keep building the life they thought they could take from you. And maybe, just maybe, one quiet day at a time you realize it wasn't the fire that defined you. It was how you rebuilt. People sometimes ask me what I learned from it all: losing my marriage, my home, the life I thought I'd built. I tell them it's not about what I lost. It's about what I refused to surrender. I didn't let betrayal turn me bitter. I didn't let anger become my compass. I didn't burn back what they burned down. Instead, I laid new foundation, slow, honest, mine. The truth is, no one is immune to being blindsided. You can love fully, give generously, serve with honor, and still find yourself looking at an empty house and a cold email. Life isn't always fair, but it's always revealing. When someone sets fire to your life, you don't stand there with a bucket and hope they stop. You get out. You breathe. You let the smoke clear. And when you're ready, you rebuild. Not out of spite, but out of strength. The next time someone walks into your life, they won't be stepping into ashes. They'll be stepping into something solid, something real. And you'll know no matter what happens next, you didn't just survive. You reclaimed your life and made damn sure it was fireproof this time.